Okay, this homework is a little bit involved, but the basic ideas are the same. And the key ideas are really specify the null hypothesis, uh, figure out what the significance level is, and then find the relevant either or formulation for the conclusion. Okay? The stuff in between is just standard steps, and the rest is just reading comprehension. So in this case, if you read it through, and this is taken from another real-world example, Vioxx was actually taken off the market because of some of these very critiques. Um, and you got a lot of, if you watch drug commercials nowadays, they have all these sort of exclusions or qualifications or this and that. It just goes on endlessly. You might think, what is it? Why even take the drug when you got all these other sort of qualifications that you're making? I mean, it's sort of like if someone's trying to sell you something and they say, well, but this and that, and including this and that, but you might have. I mean, if they're going to go on that long, something is seemingly up, right? Why all these sort of additions? That's because very often they're using statistical tests, but the tests themselves to get on the market, they just have to pass by the FDA some basic level statistical tests, and then they don't know exactly if the causation is there. If one, the drug actually works, or two, it doesn't have massive side effects of the sort that outweigh the drug itself. So they're running really a live experiment on the population very often to see if the drug works and what its side effects are. A scary thought if you think about it. So what's the null hypothesis here? That Vioxx has no effects. Basically, uh, it doesn't have any relation to heart attack, right? And you can look this up, Google it. What is Vioxx supposed to be used for? I mean, there's a bit of deep irony here. Okay, the statistical model being used, remember, you don't really need to use this. And so since we didn't emphasize it, just to give you a brief rundown, it's basically the parameters for how this experiment was run. There were 2,000 patients. They took statistics from a placebo versus Vioxx. So that's enough for the statistical model. They don't say what particular program they use. Almost always they use computer programs. They just input the data and the thing runs the mathematics in the background. What's the mean and standard deviation for this model? The mean was 10 and the standard deviation is 3. How do you know? Well, it's there in the towards the end of this first page, second to last paragraph from the bottom. You get a standard error, that's basically standard deviation, of just over 3. So it's just over 3 sigma. And how many events? What's the mean? 10 events out of, basically that means 10 people had a cardiac event, whatever that means. Maybe a heart attack, maybe a palpitation. They just call it events. Okay? What's the significance level then? Well, if it's 3 sigma, the p level, the significance level is always the opposite of that, the remaining, so it's 1%, right? The significance level is 1%. If it were 2 sigma, 95%, what's called the significance level would be the 5%, or 5, p level of 5%. 1E, what's the test data? It's the data you get from cardiac events versus non-events. Okay, the last one, the important one. How do you correctly state the conclusion from the data? So the null hypothesis, which you stated up here, the conclusion is either the null hypothesis is true and something unusual occurred at the 1% level, or the null hypothesis is false. Yeah? Basically, that's saying either the null hypothesis is true, meaning Vioxx doesn't have any relation to heart attacks, and the results you got were highly unusual, right? They only occur 1% of the time. Maybe that's an artifact of the people you chose for your study. Maybe they were, you know, or the null hypothesis is false. Vioxx indeed has a relation to heart attacks, heart events. So the inclination here, because you got something occurring at the 1% level, the inclination is to say that Vioxx actually contributes to cardiac events, in particular heart attacks. You don't know that for sure, but this study seems to indicate that there is a correlation there. and it's worth investigating further. And indeed, people did investigate this further, as I mentioned before, and it turned out later on Vioxx was taken off the market, if memory serves right. You can look that up on Google. Okay, so that was just a reading comprehension question. For the second one, how do you respond to the criticism leveled in the second piece? This is another one just to read through carefully. They got this abortion pill, RU486, mifepristone, I don't know how you pronounce it. The abortion pill, basically, right? And if you look at the stats, it's kind of interesting. They mentioned Vioxx, and the product was taken by 20 million Americans. It caused, I'm reading this from the second page, it caused 14 deaths before the FDA took action. That's 14 out of 20 million. That's a very, very small percentage. 14 out of 24, okay? So let's put this in context. You take this abortion pill, at least 14 people died, let's just say 14, out of 20 million who took it, and then the FDA took action. By contrast, Vioxx, which we just covered here, had been known to cause heart attacks, intestinal bleeding, kidney and liver impairment, but the FDA didn't really act. It was already known, but they didn't act. Whereas by contrast, this abortion pill, 14 deaths, and then they take action almost immediately, even though that's a minuscule amount. By comparison, what they're saying here in the article is Vioxx has a way higher incidence of all these kinds of things, deaths and other problems, right? Way higher versus 14 out of 20 million, way smaller percentage. What's going on here? Why are they acting on one side and not the other? Okay? Well, that's kind of the point. In this case, medicine is politicized. When you talk about abortion pills, it's a politically charged topic. And if you read through it, it gives you further details of just how sort of egregious the comparison is. Read it. It's basically drawing a bunch of interesting parallels, not just between Vioxx, but also our food system, right? Why is there no warning label on Big Macs, which also, I mean, alcohol, for example, seems to cause more deaths or is related to greater sickness than the incidence of, say, certain legalized drugs, and yet there's no talk of banning that as such, or at least no serious talk. There's a strange kind of blindness in our society where it turns it casts light on certain things that ought perhaps by comparison not to be cast light on, and by comparison other big glaring things it turns away from. It's not just our diets, alcohol, but more recently the gun debate, right? I mean, there's already been stats run across the world by various people who do this on a professional basis, and they say when you look at programs across the world where they've banned assault rifles and weapons and whatnot, there has been a drastic reduction in the incidence of mass killings, mass shootings. And this statistical study has been questioned, but it's been backed up by various studies over and over again. So this is a key question. The politics say governing why we still let people have, guns and claim that it's backed by the Second Amendment, which is also a disputable interpretation, and not consider other ramifications where, say, in Australia, they had something similar to the U.S., something similar to the Second Amendment. There was mass shootings. They then imposed restrictions on assault rifles and whatnot, and they found a drastic reduction in the incidence of the kinds of things that are still occurring in the U.S., but very rarely is this sort of study made sense of or even mentioned in political discourse in modern media in the U.S. So you might wonder about that. And what this article is bringing out in talking about the abortion pill is that very often these things are politicized. And very often you have to ask, where's the money coming from? I mean, pharmaceuticals are huge lobbyists with huge influence. The NRA also is a huge lobby with huge influence, not to mention its voter base. So politics inevitably plays a part in how stats are very often not just used, but abused. And it's something to keep in mind when you guys hear of stats. It can go any number of ways. When done responsibly and accurately, it can be a useful tool, but it also, by its very nature, is open to various kinds of abuses and misuses. All right, that's it for the homework. We're moving on in the next chapter to something stronger. Since statistics is so often abused, how do you get something a bit stronger? That's where confidence intervals come in, but unfortunately the case there as well as it can and often is abused. Okay, see you next time.